بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. حضورنا الكريم، شكرا جزيلا على حضوركم تواجدكم معنا اليوم. راح أتكلم بعد إذنكم بالإنجليزي، أعمل تقديم حق ضيفنا اليوم هني بروفيسور جوليان ويليامز. Good evening everyone. Thank you for coming, thank you for making the time. Really appreciate basically taking the trouble and joining us here today. Today we're going to be the talk by Professor Julian Williams, Professor of Finance and Accounting. He's the head of Finance and Accounting at Durham University in the UK. He is, let me just read out a little bit about him in introduction. His work basically focuses between financial modeling, valuation, asset capital allocation, and operational modeling of organization. He's interested in both empirical and theoretical models, usually game theory and dynamic programming of decision-making under uncertainty. Generally, he teaches in areas relating to financial decision-making and operational risk, as well as econometrics and applied statistics. The topic of AI, it's a buzzword that is touching on our everyday life. And basically, when we talk about economics and how to use AI in economics, basically, I will just give a brief introduction. I profess that I'm not an expert, a subject expert in this matter. He is, so I'm not going to steal the thunder. However, when you have large data sets, how to deal with those large data sets and how to basically use AI to help in indexing, analyzing, and basically try to answer some of those questions. Some of the topics that Julian will be talking about today is that how to go about both AI and economics, looking at it from theoretical point of view, as well as from practical point of view, and the applications. He's going to be talking about some interesting case studies that have taken place, and also today there has been a huge development in the market, which is going to be touching upon. So without further ado, I basically introduce Professor Julian Williams to basically enlighten us about AI in economics.
This, as with any work that you do, is always with a large group of people. This is two of my colleagues, Halbin and Grace from Durham University, have been with me from the start of doing this work, but there's actually probably about 30 to 40 people that I should put on this slide, so I apologize to all of those people in advance for not including them. But I also like to say thank you to the Kuwait Economic Society and the Arab Planning Institute for having me come here today. It's been really nice of them to do that. So one of the things that I'm not going to do in this talk is talk a lot about the moral philosophy of AI. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing whether we should do anything with that. I'm going to talk more about what we've got now, how it's working, and the potential applications that work within finance and economics. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about what happened today, because I think that's something that's been quite interesting. And one of the sections that I want to focus on is on fine-tuning. And I think that's something that's suddenly come... a lot of investment analysts today have suddenly realized what fine-tuning means, and that has made a significant change in the valuation of some very large companies. So I think that's something that's quite interesting that's there. So AI in fintech covers a significantly broad area of just from credit modeling all the way through to blockchain. So there's very, very large number of different areas that we can think about within AI, machine learning, fintech. And my previous sort of expertise in area over the last 10 years has actually been in distributed models like blockchain. And so there's something that we've done a lot of work on over time. But as we moved in, the fusion of financial technologies models and large language models became more important. And I wanted to sort of... oh, sorry, I'll talk a bit up in. Yeah, there we go, that bit closer. So one of the things would be to say, why should you listen to me? Why should you think about Durham, my home institution, as being a good place to do work on that? And why is it that the fusion of the different areas has been so important? One of the issues that came out is that the use of high-performance computing, understanding how high-performance computing works, and Durham is one of the key universities in the UK for high-performance computing, and that's one of the parts as to why it's been important on that front. So we house a whole bunch of supercomputers, mostly for physics and for various other bits and pieces, but this is why. So if you've ever seen a picture of a galaxy colliding or anything like that, it's probably done in a Durham supercomputer, because that's where we are a big specialty. One of the byproducts of that is that in my home institution, we have a lot of expertise in large language models, in models of big data, in models that require large simulations, and that's something that's useful. And as it turns out now, in the large language model environment, this becomes a very critical bit of skills to have. So it's not just the software, it's also the hardware, and that's something that's good, and that's a good education for people like myself, coming from business and management, finance, economics. We know a lot of math, we know a lot of models, but the question is, how do we implement them in the machine? And that's something that we can do here. So, as I said, what the talk is not about. I'm not going to talk too much about automation, not going to talk too much about the implications for workers, although every time I've had a talk like this, it's tended to sort of resolve back to that at some stage. But I'm going to talk more about how these things work and what we're using them for, and I'll also link it today with the big movements in the market today, which tells us why this topic is quite timely. I think Issam has gone through and given, and has kind of stolen my slide 7 really, without seeing it, because this is exactly what he just described now. Taking large data sets, structured and unstructured data sets, and deploying them in a way that's useful for financial decision making and economic decision making. What portfolio should you select? How should you hedge interest rate risk? How should a government plan its horizon of investments? These are all things that can be done using these large language models, taking the vast amount of data that a modern economy. Kuwait is an advanced modern economy. It will generate huge amounts of data in structured and unstructured ways, and we need to have ways of incorporating that into our decision making so that we improve welfare for everybody. When we're talking about large language models, we're generally talking about generative models. And that's the slight difference between LLMs and our traditional idea of what we call machine learning. Machine learning was purely about learning data and fitting to a model for decision making. Large language models can now generate information, and I think we're all very used to that.
Examples?
Well, the example would be the card I gave to my dad for his 78th birthday. I went into DAL 3, I asked it to generate a very specific set of, my dad's a big sci-fi fan, so I wanted a nice picture of like a gas giant with a space station and a big like happy birthday hue on a ship and stuff. Not something you find on a card, and it generates it for you. So it can generate it from scratch. Okay. And you give it some kind of prompt, and they're chat bots, they're picture bots, they're mechanisms that allow you to reply and to innovate in the way that as if you were talking to a normal person. So if I ask you and prompt you with something, you will come back and say, it'll be like this. And sometimes you will say more than I prompted you with, and sometimes you'll say less. Whereas in traditional machine learning, we had a model to fit, and then we asked data to be fitting to it. So it's a slightly different approach. So this is what we mean by generative in that sense. And I think everybody knows LLMs, but I wanted to just show everybody here a couple of papers, and those are research papers, that are important because it's just useful to know these papers because they exist, because they're the start of this particular setup. So probably the most important one, every large language model that you see out there, doesn't matter which one it is, will be based at the moment on the transformer technology. So the transformer architecture is a way of ordering artificial neural networks to analyze data. And Google introduced this in 2017 in this paper called Attention is All You Need, based on the song title by the Beatles. And it's a very technical paper, but it explains how that architecture works, and it released the open source version of the transformer architecture out there. It didn't give you a trained model. It didn't tell you, here's a model that works. It just says, this is how you can use it for modeling. And that's part of what they were doing. And this is the big innovation. There's a new paper from Google that was released 2 weeks ago called Titans. So they have transformers, and now they've gone to Titans. And there's a slight difference with Titans in the sense of the size of the input data is now much bigger. So these models would take small prompts like draw me a picture of X and Y for the thing, or talk to me about a small poem or something like that, and it would generate this model. These new ones now can actually read almost like a novel's length of material and then synthesize that back to you in one go. So that's a short memory architecture called Titan, and I think that might be something that might be interesting in the future. So Transform is the one that's there. The paper that first introduced me to these models in 2018 was by Temnik Gabru and co-authors called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. And this was the first paper that kind of said, maybe these models are not so good and there's some issues with them and things like that. And there's a huge story about the authors of this paper. It's a very interesting story about Google and their staff and arguments and things like that. And just Google this paper and you'll see the story of it. It's quite amazing. It's one of those things that you can put in a movie, and it's quite there. But this is the first time that we actually looked at it, and this was looking at GPT-1, GPT-2, before we saw GPT-3, which was a couple of years ago. So you can see this was quite ahead of its time in terms of understanding these things. In economics and econometrics, because I know we've got a lot of economists in the house, a very famous economist from Stanford University, Susan Athey, and she has an early paper in Journal of Econometrics, which came out in 2024, which is actually looking at this as a new way of doing Monte Carlo simulations, which is big. For all of you who do economics, when you do empirical economics, you want confidence bounds, you want to be able to say if something's statistically significant or not, and this is a way of using large models, or in this case Wasserstein adversarial networks, which is a form of this case, to generate data sets that are actually more close to the real data. So I think these are quite interesting ways to go. So we've seen over the last, I would say, I'm tempted to cough too, but I won't do that. We've seen over the last 6-7 years a bubble growing. A bubble, and it's a bit naughty to say that because we don't know until it pops if it's really a bubble. But what we saw is that half of all stock gains in the US in the last 5 years were driven by AI related stock increases. So this is a huge area. Today we saw the correction. We saw a big correction. We saw Nvidia down 10%. We saw some of these electric companies supplying this down 15-20%. And I'm going to come to one of the reasons why I think that's important, because there's beginning to be a schism in the area of LLMs in terms of how they're deployed and what's going to make them valuable for the economy as a whole and how they're going to be used. I really like this. My graduate student, Haubin, he put this picture together for me as this kind of like flow chart of how the development of these different models came in. And there's a couple I want to just highlight here. Llama from Meta being one of them. And I think Llama might well be the most important model that's ever created. Not because it's the best model, but because it's the first model for which you know everything there is about it. It's open source. And they published the parameters, they published the model, but most importantly, they published the mechanism that you use for retraining it. So Meta, most people find that Meta sometimes is not the most socially responsible of companies. I think this is a reasonable thing to be able to say. But in this case, they've really gone out and said, right, we're going to give you everything about our model, and you're going to be able to see how it works in that ways. Whereas most of the other models that you see, like ChatGPT, and any of the other ones on here. Most of them are what we call closed source models. So you basically don't see the model operating, you don't know how it works. And so here's some examples of the different models that you can see here. And as I said, I wanted to just highlight Llama, and then obviously the famous ones like ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude. And lots of different ways of doing it. So Llama is an open source model. Anybody can download this model, but you have to run it on your own hardware. So you don't log on to a website and put your queries in Llama, you have to build your own model. And but you have access to all of the information on how to do it. And I think that's one of the interesting ones in that front. And then here's some comparisons. And in fact, I put this up, many people are sort of interested today. Today, these comparisons probably knocked off several $1 billion of several large companies' stock prices, because once they realized that some of the simpler models can actually do just as well as the large models, then they realized that there maybe wasn't as much value built into these models as you would have. So I think that's been one of the big changes today, has been that a sudden realization by a large set of investors that, hang on a second, if these smaller, simpler models can work really well, is it really that much more valuable to have these very big models that are very costly to run? And is the cash flow going to be distributed amongst a much larger group of firms than just these large tech firms that are going to be picking it out? So I have a bunch of slides here, and I think these slides can be made available. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but I'm just going to spend a little bit to explain that you've got two different types of hardware. You've got main hardware, CPUs with main memory, and then you've got graphical processing units, which typically do heavy math calculations that sit in these graphics cards, traditionally used for video games, basically, but do very, very high intensity math calculations in big parallel processing arrays. And it's quite useful to do that. It makes these models faster. So the example I would give is if I run Llama on my own hardware in my office, and we have NVIDIA chips, then if we run it in main memory, a query can take about a minute to run, whereas in the GPUs, then on a good GPU, it can take like less than a second. So you're talking, a speed up of 200-300 times. So, and for even more sophisticated GPUs, that can be 2,000-3,000 times. So the bigger and better your GPUs, the faster your model runs. And this is just explaining what the difference is between GPUs and CPUs. And one of them is about generalist processing of any kinds of applications, and GPUs are more about math programming. In the old days, when I was young, because I'm very old, we used to call them math coprocessors. So this is the old way of calling them math coprocessors. And GPU code looks very different from the code that most of us would be used to. So if you've ever written code in Python or R or Stata, then you would look at the code for GPUs and think it's actually quite weird. It has these weird arrays, and you do everything simultaneously rather than in batches, which is something that's kind of interesting. A little bit of math, but what I would say is the following, okay? When you have a model of this size, the math is meaningless. Okay, you don't need any math at all. Because when you have a model of this size, literally, it's so big that you're writing things that, they say that you can describe things in words, you can describe things in math, and you can describe things in code. Mm-hmm. So you get to the point where these models are so big, they can only be described in code. The math is embedded in the code. I want a big shout out to George Cybenko, who, I don't know if anybody who knows who George Cybenko is actually somebody I've met several times. He's at Dartmouth College, and he's a famous computer scientist, and what he wrote was a paper called the Universal Approximation Theorem. And what this says is that any model, any process, any system, whether your brain, can be, as long as there's certain conditions, can always be approximated by an artificial neural network. Mm-hmm. So what this tells you is that there's nothing these things can't do if they're sufficiently complicated. So that's the important thing. You don't need to worry about the fact it's approximation, just that as long as there's sufficiently large number of parameters, they're sufficiently complicated, then there's nothing that they can do in that particular way. Okay. So So these are what we call neural networks, and this is what forms the basis of all of these models, transformer architecture, Titan architecture, whatever. And as I said, we have these things called attention and self-attention. This is just to do with how you order these neural networks and how you structure them. So it's not really that interesting. What's more interesting is the difference between an encoder and a decoder. So when you think about how you interact with large language models, Uber, you have Uber here? Yes, we have Uber. Kareem. So when you look up an address, you don't always get the address correct, do you? You sometimes type it in wrong. But usually it guesses correctly for you, yes? So what you have is you have ones where you're transforming an input and you're interpreting the intention of the input. So here you are putting a noisy input, maybe a potentially misspelt word. And so, for example, maybe I put your name in, I accidentally missed one S. Yeah. But the computer knows that because it can actually encode it in a way that understands what my intention was. And then it corrects me and it says, no, you made a mistake, and it corrects it. So every time we type in on our phones, sometimes the Apple autocorrect's great and sometimes it's terrible, but this is going to be an encoder. Google's encoder, BERT, which is the one that you use when you're doing searches. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you search on Google, you spell it wrong or you make a mistake, but it still gets you the right answer? That's how the encoder works. And at the same time, you have an output version where it's taking an input and it's constructing it into a decoder. So it's actually then giving you output that's replying back to you. So that's the difference between encoders and decoders. And in that famous paper, Google, who are the originators of this technology, they provide a lot of instruction on how to understand queries, outputs, and generation. And that's what all of these nice pictures are. It's basically our interpretation of how these things are. And this tells you how words are constructed in that ways. There's actually a very nice YouTube video by a guy called 3 Blue 1 Red, who does a beautiful, beautiful illustration, much better than me, but it's there. So I'm just going to skip through this very quickly because I want to get to the applications. So what we see here is that I just want to get to the example of Llama. So in Llama, which is Meta's large language model, they make it available for you to use, as I said, in your machine. You can then interrogate it as you want. But the most important thing is you can fine-tune it to the application that you're interested in. And that's what we've been doing in Durham, using our supercomputing infrastructure. So the idea would be is that we come up with new kinds of tasks and what we call chains of thought, which we then use to train the model. And you've got different ways of, and then here's some examples of getting it right and wrong, which you can have a look at if you have the slides. But what you can then do is you can really tune exactly how much randomness and how much volatility there is in the output. So sometimes you want it to be very consistent, and sometimes you want it to be very imaginative. So maybe when you've been using Copilot, sometimes it says be more creative, be less creative, and that's basically tuning some of these parameters that are in here. I won't talk too much about hallucinations. Hallucinations is where the language models get it wrong, basically, and they start to create problems. But I want to talk a bit about fine-tuning, because today, fine-tuning has been the big name of the day, and that's been... so I did these slides months and weeks ago, so I didn't predict today's market crash. But today what happened was that a company called DeepSeek came out. They produced a model, which when they did the Chinese company, they spent about 6 million with an M, not billion with a B, on infrastructure, and they came out with a model that is based on Llama. So they took the original 70 billion parameter Llama model, they fine-tuned it with their own data sets, and they managed to tweak Llama to outperform many of the standard large language models that we use all the time, such as ChatGPT, especially the 3.5 and the 4.5 version. And that created absolute consternation, because you can remember that Donald Trump said we're going to spend 500 billion on Project Stargate for infrastructure. And the question then is that if this Chinese company can do 6 million, can outperform the latest model based on an already trained model, why the hell do you need 500 billion for a data center? This is the big, and I think this will be the question of our time. And this has been a big debate, and there are serious computer scientists. I have colleagues of mine in the computer science department in Durham who will be spitting blood and demanding a right to reply, because we have this big discussion all the time about should we have large generalist models or should we have smaller trained models that are specific for a task. I'm a big believer that these smaller trained models on smaller infrastructure, I think you can do a very good job with even $2-3 million worth of investment. You see online now people reviewing the new NVIDIA graphics card, and they're running Llama, and they're saying, oh, it runs Llama in 0.2 seconds on their own graphics card, $2,000. Well, there are thousands of these kids are going to be running Llama on it. So why on earth are we spending so much money when for $2,000 these kids are doing it? So the technology is catching up with ourselves in this sorts of ways. And I think for business users with specific needs and specific requirements, because we talked about the types of requirements you might have, yes. You're tailoring these models in some particular way. And so if you've got a smaller model, and if you could just get a small company to come in and just tailor the model for you, or you have your own little IT group do it for you, then that really negates the need for these huge generalist models. So how is that? And that means that the cash flow is going to be distributed amongst a much larger group of firms than just, OpenAI and Anthropic and Microsoft. So I think this is one of the interesting things. So it could be that Facebook Meta's decision to publish the entire Llama model becomes one of the most consequential decisions in the whole of the AI industry. And just to show you that it is not just DeepSeek today that created there's been lots of different Stanford with their, because Llama is large language model, something or other, but a llama is an animal. So they created their version called Alpaca, which is obviously a type of llama. And that was a smaller model, and it was really, really good at doing finance. And we've got quite a few other ones which are here. So you've got ones that are dedicated for translation in Chinese. You've got ones that are dedicated for clinical work and that sorts of things. And I think that once you're an investor and you suddenly look a little bit more into this, and you suddenly realize, there's universities out there that are spending, $1.5–2 million on infrastructure and doing a completely fine-tuned version of Llama that's specific for a particular need that they want. So why are businesses not able to do that? And then does that mean that the investments or the valuations that you have of these larger industries is overvalued? And I think that's what we've seen in this correction today. So here's some fine-tuning examples, but I want to go to one in economics because we're economists and we want to talk about economics. So the one that we're looking at is FOMC. So the Federal Open Markets Committee sets interest rates in the United States. These are obviously very consequential. You in Kuwait here are pegged to the US dollar, so therefore your yield curves and your borrowing costs and things like that are pegged to these decisions, as with most countries in this region. And so we want to know more about...
Small correction. I mean, dollar only represents about 60% of the basket of currencies.
60%.
So we're skewed towards dollars, not as much as the rest of the GCC.
That's true. Yes. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And in fact, I had this example yesterday, 2 days ago, and last week, and we were looking at the exchange rates, because exchange rates are influenced by this, and Kuwait's very flat, whereas many of the other currencies are quite volatile relative to these situations for that particular reason exactly. So you're right, absolutely. There's another Julian called Julian Cook who I work with on foreign currencies. He's probably slapping his head to sort of walk straight into that one. So what you want to do is prepare the data set. These FOMC reports, they come in things like the Green Book and the Grey Book, and they're published online by the US Federal Reserve. And you can put those data straight into Llama. And you can train Llama directly on that, and you can say, here is the yield curve at this time, here is the FOMC report, here are all the future yield curves, here are all the past yield curves, and the model will begin to learn. And it will begin to learn over time. And it doesn't take that much power to do this. We ran this on machines that were relatively similar in size to what DeepSeek was doing, and it took us a few weeks to do and retrain the model on the FOMC reports. And in fact, what we can do now is we could even create synthetic economies. We can create versions of the US economy with different yield curves and generate a text attached to it. So we can generate the entire system. So we can create thousands of copies of the US economy under different economic scenarios with different outlooks, with different grey books and different green books, all synthetically generated through these models, which I think is quite interesting on that one.
Just for the benefit of our audience, I mean, how long does it take to do this, basically, I wouldn't say manually, but in a traditional manner?
It's impossible.
Thank you.
An infinite amount of time.
Yeah.
You just never would do it.
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, I suppose, there are large banks out there that might have sort of 500 analysts looking at different parts of these books and things like that. Mm-hmm. Hedge funds that have large numbers of analysts doing that. But that simulation based is impossible without these kinds of models. And literally, all of this stuff here on these slides is just telling you about the process of doing this fine tuning. And the most important thing from your perspective is not what the fine tuning does, it's that A, it's possible, and B, it only takes weeks on relatively modest hardware that costs millions of dollars, because we have all of that stuff because we've got the physicists. And that's the same thing that any small, medium enterprise can do. You buy some old chips, 6, 8 months, 10 months old. Doesn't have to be the brand new stuff. You can put this together and you can train your own model for your particular purposes. You want a model that's specifically about oil prices in the GCC, specifically about, commodities and that sorts of ways. You can build your own one in exactly the same way in a short period of time. So I think this has been one of the reasons why this has been realization that A, it's not that hard, and B, you don't need that much money to make these things work.
And that helps basically in the decision-making process.
We can use it for all sorts of things. You can use it for resilience planning, insurance. You can use it for hedging. You can use it for understanding what's going to the impact of changes in long-run oil prices on your economy. You can use it to try and prevent shocks to your social welfare schemes, because you might have different changes in monetary value. So you can basically use it to construct really, really quite powerful decision tools that can help you understand where your money is going within your economy in that ways. If it's in the US, yield curves affect every single thing from mortgage prices all the way through to how companies fund themselves. So this is why it's something that's kind of important for us to have a good handle on.
And you can make exceptional profits in the market as well.
Yes. You want me to give me my example? You really, really want that example. So I was, I just say that this is the end of the talk on this sorts of things, but one of the examples that we had about exceptional profits was that, and I was explaining this to Dr. Sam, sometimes you only ever see the truth in court cases. Mm-hmm. So about 6 months ago, or 8 months ago, there was a court case between two large US hedge funds, and what happened was, very typical, I used to work in the hedge fund industry. There's a successful team in one group, and they were then poached by another hedge fund. I actually won't mention too much of the names just in case I get in trouble. And they were poached by the other hedge fund, and they went to the other hedge fund. And then the hedge fund that they'd left from sued the new hedge fund because their profits went down. And then the question would be okay, this is really interesting because the two people who are running these two hedge funds are quite famous characters, and they have a lot of relationship with like Donald Trump and things like that. So they're quite a big deal in the financial services industry. One of them is Millennium Capital. And so what was the topic about? Was it about FOMC reports or something in the US? No, it was about Indian options. So it was about equity options, which is a very niche part of a market in India, which is a very, obviously, it's a big country, but it's relatively speaking a small market. Yeah. And what was the discussion about was, well, they had a very sophisticated model, partially based on artificial intelligence, that was trading in the Indian market. And over the year or a bit that they'd been trading previously for the other hedge fund, they'd made $2.4 billion in excess profits. And what's interesting about that is that that's basically half of all positive value trades in the Indian market went to these two guys with this system. And they were then being sued because they'd taken that system to another company. And of course, their profits had then dropped by 90%. This obviously caused a little bit of eye-opening in India because this is a US court case. These are US. They've never set foot in India at all. They've got nothing to do with the Indian economy. They're not informed investors that have come out of India and gone to the US. These are just traders who are trading an algorithm algorithmically using AI technology in the US, but it happens to be in India. And they were taking roughly about half of the excess returns there. And, I think we have a question to ask ourselves is that, do we want to have these situations where there's so much technology gradient between groups of traders that you end up with huge amounts of capital being withdrawn from an economy like India. And there was well understood that day traders and retail traders in India in this equity options market were getting absolutely hammered. And who was on the counterparty of them? Well, it was just these two guys from the US with their model. So, and we wouldn't have known anything about that. There would have been no information about that at all unless they'd gone to court and sued each other over it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, then the court filings and disclosure, we start to see everything there. And at that point, we then see, this is quite an interesting sort of case in this particular ways. So the summary of my sort of talk really is that we've got these very complex models that we can do, but there are, as with everything, there's a gradient of complexity that generally from these huge models like ChatGPT, that the latest versions with trillions of parameters, down to more specific models where you have billions of parameters, still very big models. And there is a debate as to whether we should be, effectively investing mostly in these very big models, or whether there should be a more distributed investment in lots of smaller models. And I think if I'd given this talk a week ago, and there were computer scientists in the room, they would have probably given me quite a hard time. And I said, well, look at ChatGPT, look at OpenAI, look at Microsoft, look at these big ones like Anthropic. He said, this is where it's at. But I think in the last week, we've had, it's so quick, the realization that and our experience over the last 2 years of doing this work is that it's not that hard, that this is not something that's completely out, that you shouldn't think that this is only work that can be done by massive teams of software engineers with huge models and massive data centers. A university with a couple of $1 million worth of investment, probably even a couple of $100,000 worth of investment, can build their own models. They can design them for the specific purposes that they want, and they can be very, very effective. And the example would be the Millennium Capital one of an effective model. It wasn't quite an LLM, but it was an effective model that was generating huge profits without having that massive 500 billion data center that you need to have. So I think that's the sort of the key takeaway from that perspective. And I was sort of feeling very happy today because of this big market movement, and it's probably one of the largest corrections we've had for a few years, so it's quite interesting.
Question to you, and then I'll open the floor for questions from the floor. With AI, where does basically the human element basically, does it diminish in value or does it increase in value?
Yes. So as I said at the start, I was going to avoid the discussion on these ones, but I will. I think
we'll just get rid of all our research teams basically, because if we have such a sophisticated AI sort of modules that can do things much faster, efficient, and without the basically and with much more resilience and trust and the data sort of it's calculating. Well, assuming that the parameters are done correctly, I mean, then where does the human element come into play? So,
showing my age, I remember when we started to see the introduction of things like spreadsheets into offices, and at the same time people were like, well, if we have spreadsheets in offices, will that mean that we won't have any more administrators? Okay. I think it'll just change the way that we do work. It'll change the way that we do work. There are always winners and losers when it comes to any kind of new technology introduction. That it's impossible not to have that. As soon as you have some innovation in that ways, we have to adapt. Okay, there's no doubt about it. With robotics, for example, changes the way that we do manufacturing greatly. It doesn't replace the need for people in manufacturing, but it means that each individual person then becomes more productive. And I think what we're seeing here is with this, similarly to this automation that we see in these systems, these information systems, that level of automation is going to make us more productive in certain ways. Will it mean that we need less people for doing certain things? Potentially, yes. You might require less, simple things like, when you might have a valuation farm if you're in a private equity firm where you've got loads of people doing lots of valuations of different firms to select the ones you're there. this could obviously do a lot of that for you almost instantaneously. But still, you're going to need to have the decision. Remember, these models are not intelligent, really. They are massive correlation models. So they correlate lots of information together, but they are not reasoning in that ways. They are simulating reasoning, but they are not doing reasoning. Now, one might argue that actually, even us, we only simulate reason because we have a massive neural network in our brain as well. And there might well be a time when one of these models becomes more complicated than the human brain. But, you know, a pleasing thing that my friends in the biosciences group says, that the most complicated thing in the known universe that we still understand at the moment is the human brain. And we still have yet to find anything more complicated or build something more complicated. So I think we're a few years away from getting rid of our research teams and doing it that way.
So people can feel confident, basically, they can keep their jobs as analysts. And, you know, they can still go ahead and do their CFAs and CPAs and whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't endorse any particular financial qualification over any others. You know, there are many. But I think you can be happy to know. I think the most important thing is that you should be able to understand how these things work. Yeah. I think one of the things that will be there is, you know, 15 years ago when I first started sort of doing serious finance, many people didn't understand simple things like option prices. And it wasn't considered to be a common knowledge to look at derivatives, for example. But now I think almost everybody who does a CFA has a very good knowledge of derivatives, because they have to, right? And it's the largest market, and we didn't understand it from that way. So it used to be that there was a niche market. So I think here's the same thing. In the CFA exam in the next 10 years, I'm sure that there will be something on large language models, how you do about using it, how you go about customizing them, something on these sorts of lines, and the ethics of using them as too, because we don't talk too much about the ethics of them, but I mean, you know, there is some ethical side of that. At some point, you have to take responsibility for the investments that you make, and you can't just say, well, the LLM told me to do it, you know, so, you know, that artificial intelligence defense doesn't work. You still have to take responsibility. There's still an ethical and moral component to the human condition that's important on that front.
Thank you very much. We're happy to take any questions from the floor. Please.
Where is the added value to the normal person? The intelligence. What is it? I mean, I know you're talking about more technical. I'm not that much familiar in that topic. But what I'm saying, asking for for the audience, what do I gain? Is there any limit? And who is the most advanced in this technology? Is it USA or China is going to catch up? Or the overall benefit to individuals and human beings? Thank you very much.
I mean, just to reframe this question, basically, how does this apply to econometrics or economic studies and you know, AI for basically for normal people who basically are in this space?
So I think, okay, three levels of answering this question. So level number one, you know, how does it apply to my mum? Okay, my mum is not an unsophisticated person. She was in the nuclear industry for 40 years. She's quite she's there, but she's nearly 80 years old. And so she's a sort of, you know, she likes technology, but not that much. It adds a level of heuristic interaction with devices. It means that you don't have to be exactly correct every time when you're asking things. It's designed there to have that sort of fuzzy interaction that's helpful when you're dealing with it. Second level, from the level of an economist who's doing economics work. If you think about what are the key questions of our time, these are what we call upstream versus downstream models. An upstream model is like an LLM that describes everything about a data set. A downstream model is a question. What happens when we add an extra child to the classroom? What happens when we add an extra teacher to the classroom? What happens when we instigate some kind of policy in healthcare? Okay, we want to ask these big, broad questions, and these LLMs and the generative data that they can do can give us better answers to the statistical significance of those kinds of effects.
Interest rates.
What's the impact of interest rates? What's the impact of hedging on firms? You can ask these questions, and these models will give you better answers, but they'll give you more robust answers as to the direction of travel of these things, because they're going to be able to understand and interrogate the data at a deeper level, but you're still going to be able to ask the clean statistical experiments that we are asking for. We go back to Clive Granger and the causality models that he would introduced in the 1950s and 60s. We still ask these questions. We want to know, what are these causal effects? And these models will help us understand these causal effects in cleaner ways. So we can ask, these are complicated models, but they can allow us to ask clean questions. I think that's kind of helpful on that sort of front. At the same time, who is the most sophisticated? Well, this is an interesting question. Who has done the most work to deliver these kinds of models in a way that can be usable? Well, that's clearly Google. They invented the transformer technology, which is the open source technology where everybody uses. And they delivered the Titan model, which is the most recent version, the update of the transformer architecture. And so that's there. Who has been the most successful at monetizing it? Well, clearly Microsoft and OpenAI. Microsoft is now the most valuable company in the world because it's been, speculated to be very good on this front. Who is the best technically in terms of the countries of origin? Well, the UK and the US are big in this kind of areas. Many of the people who've won Nobel Prizes for these large language models, and the several Nobel Prizes given out in physics for using machine learning were given out to people who've been trained in the UK and in the US. The US has obviously been much better at monetizing than the UK, because we're always terrible at monetizing anything. We like to be just, here we go, world, have something, and do you want some money for it? No, it's fine. And then the Americans come along and say, yeah, we'll charge you $5 for it. Or we'll do something like, we'll invent like the architecture that underlines every phone in the world and then just sell it at a bargain, like the ARM software, ARM technology. But so clearly the US has a big lead in that. I think what China is doing very well is making the downstream models, the ones that are applied, and they're taking that open source architecture and applying it in lots of different spaces. And I don't know if any of you have spent much time in China. I spent quite a bit of time in China. And it's really impressive how they've embedded a lot of AI into lots of different things, like how they do IDs, how they do sales, location tracking, and all sorts of other stuff that just helps you in your everyday life. And you have these apps that can do things in that sort of ways, and it's quite impressive. And what China has in an advantage is large numbers of people who are well trained in software engineering, but also are kind of lean because they haven't been given access to massive data centers with huge numbers of processors. So they know how to optimize a lot because they have to, because of the various different bands that they've had on the processors. And that's meant, and I think there's an article in the FT today asking, how could they do it so cheaply? And the answer was because they've got lots of PhDs in the right area, and those PhDs are used to having to improvise because they don't have access to all the technology and the kit that the PhDs in the UK and the US have access to. So I think that's quite an interesting one there. So I think this is that's my 4-stage answer to your question. I hope I've covered the key points for you. It might have very little, but it could have some significant impact because if you're buying insurance, for example, it could you might be able to tailor your insurance correctly. It will help understand how your particular you probably have some decisions that you have to make. Safety in your car, for example, those sorts of things. Embedded AI is something we haven't even talked about today, like how you embed this stuff in cars and things like that. And that might well be the things that are going to be helping you mostly in the future. Your interaction with the this stuff that I'm talking about now is mostly going to be in the fact that, well, hopefully, services will be cheaper. That people will be more productive, the services will be cheaper, and that will gain you a better yield on investments that you make, and it will mean that the cost of products that you have will be less expensive, hopefully.
Please.
So I do have two questions. The first one regarding the financial aspects of training an AI model. So where's the most cost of the AI building model? Is it from the chips, from the staff cost coding, or from collecting the data? If you can elaborate some more color on this area. The other one regarding investment decisions. So assuming that we do have the well-trained AI model, which is much more experienced than anyone because of its research and memorizing capabilities, versus the, so my question is, what's the added value of the human in the presence of well-trained AI model that know much more than you and can correlate much better than you? Where we as a human should think to add value in this process?
So I'll go in reverse order. I think for the second part, a lot of it is about how you're under. I think a lot of what you're talking about there is resilience. It's resilience of decision making. So checking to make sure that the things that you're doing are correct and how human beings are making decisions in that particular way. AI models are very good at understanding patterns and behavior. So typically in the investment industry, what we're then interested in understanding is, are there things that are dangerous to my firm? Are there things that would be out of the normal pattern of behavior in that sorts of ways? And then identifying potential opportunity sets and then providing those opportunity sets to the individual. There's a very long answer to that second part of the question, which I can go into, but I think that's a summary part of it. First part's actually much more interesting, to be honest with you, these things. So let's take a look at the different technologies. So if you take a look at, I'm going to go back to Llama. I'm sorry I keep talking about Llama all the time, but it's one of the very few really open source models. So the 70 to 80, the Llama 2, 70 billion, Llama 3, 80 billion model. If you have an array of 16 A100 processors, you can fine-tune that in about 2 weeks. Okay, typically an A100 box in the United Kingdom will cost you between $80,000 and $120,000, okay, per application. It might be more expensive here because I have to convert everything by multiplying it by 3, because it's Kuwaiti dinar, it's very expensive currency. So if you think about it from that sort of perspective, typically the business process I would expect would be is that you would have small, medium enterprises that would build a few of these boxes and then use them to do stuff for companies on a peer-based basis. It would be doubtful that a company, given usually they would be making these models one-off, would then actually justify having their own IT team in that sorts of ways. So that's why I say is that I think in the low millions of dollars, you can do a very good job. And that's been what's proven today, is that you can do that. You don't need that. Now, the argument you might say is that Meta has already spent $50 to $100 million doing the base model of Llama. So, but it's now open source for everybody to use in that ways. Now, let me give you one thing that I didn't talk about, which is very important from your perspective. Running the model is cheap, okay? Parameterizing the model is very expensive. One of the expert groups that we have in the statistics department in Durham is what we call the model emulation group. And the model emulation group takes very complicated models and they fit them on data. Even with the most advanced emulators, which Meta doesn't have the most advanced emulator in its package that it gives you, there's better ones, will take roughly a few million runs of the model, okay, to actually fit to the data. Because remember, if you're saying something like, I've got an 80 billion parameter model, the number of tokens that you're going to be training that on are going to be in the hundreds of billions or trillions. And the token is the data point, this is the input, this is the output. Those data points now are generally generated by the model itself. So it's looking at things like websites and all sorts of other stuff to try and actually then give predictions of what next words will be and what the content is. So you can train these models quite cheaply at that level, okay? So I think once you're getting into the low millions of dollars, so between, say $1 million and $10 million, you then start to have situations where, like, most reasonable sized universities will have enough technology and equipment to run these models for you. So a company could just go to a university and say, look, I'm interested in pet insurance or whatever, and I need a model that's going to be really, really good at understanding everything to do with this particular product and how it's going to work, and it's going to be generating predictions and analysis for me from data. And you train it then specifically for that particular task, and it does a particularly good job of that task. And you can do it relatively inexpensively. And I think what you're going to find is over time, there's going to be evidence that those specifically trained models will be at least as effective as the very large general models. And effectively, once you've got it there, you only need one A30 processor that's going to cost you like $3,000 to run it every single time at a speed of about, one query every quarter of a second. So unless you're going to be deploying it for everybody else to use, you don't even need that much infrastructure. So that means that running the model is really cheap. Fitting the model expensive, but it's not that expensive. Fitting a model of 1 trillion parameters is incredibly hard. That's when you need $100 million data center, $200 million data center. They're talking about models of 10 trillion parameters. Okay, now you need $1 billion data center. And I was trying to work out, as a finance people, like we're thinking about finance, where does that cash flow come from? How often did you use Bing before ChatGPT came along? Very rare, yeah? I never used it. Every time I used it one time, it didn't give me the right answer. I wasn't happy, so I went Google. So my thesis would be is that really it's about marketing. It's about advertising. So a lot of it's going to be about having the technology that drags people away from one platform to another. But the revenue generating process, coming back to our friends, like what does it mean for real things, is just going to be more about advertising. Now I use Bing all the time because I got to log into Bing to go to Copilot to generate the stuff that I want. Probably shouldn't say this, but like write a reference for something, or do something really quick. Write a business case for something like this, and it does it all quickly for me. But now I'm subject to the advertising from Microsoft rather than the advertising from Google. And I think that's literally where the cash flow is coming from. And I think that's something that's kind of interesting on that front. So I don't believe that inherently the very large language models with the cool factor have much of a cash flow attached to them, other than dragging you from one platform to another, where you're exposed to that ecosystem for spending your money on stuff. And that's where Google makes it. So I suspect a lot of it is just how much can you claw away from Google, which is ironic because they invented all the technology. So they've kind of democratized it and actually then done it. So maybe it's a very elaborate way of getting around antitrust. Yep. That could be a way.
Question?
Kuwait Vision 2035, it shows the emphasizing diversity of economics beyond oil, and focusing more on digital transformation, and how can the government itself makes more of the businesses have more awareness how to use the more new technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing and so on, and how can they emphasize it mostly in the businesses. I read an article, it shows that there's around 2% of the Middle East that they will accrue the total benefit of using the AI around in year 2030, which is give us as Kuwait country a really a good opportunity of that. My question for you, what's your suggestion for the policy makers, how they can implement or emphasize more about the artificial intelligence in their strategy and so on? My second question is for you, like in a personal base, what do you like more once you use the ChatGPT and the DeepSeek of the China? What's the most interesting part of both of them? from your own point of view?
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah. Okay, so the second question is kind of, I'll answer the first one whilst using my brain to think about a good answer to the second one. So from a policy perspective, clearly it's very, very important that you make sufficient numbers of whatever, I don't know exactly how that works in Kuwait, but what we would call scholarships available for people to do STEM. Mm-hmm. You need as many people as possible doing stuff related to STEM. And I also include economics and finance. Science, technology, engineering, and maths. And STEAM is science, technology, engineering, economics, and maths. You need people who are well versed in these particular areas, and you need to grow that group of people and retain them in your own country. That's one of the big problems that we have. We have several Nobel Prizes given away for machine learning and AI, all to British people who work in US universities now, but were trained in Nottingham and Southampton and York and places like this. So retention of the skills, importing skills, bringing people in. So that workforce skill is really important. You don't need to be a genius to implement most of these models. Meta provides an entire toolbox that allows you to basically fit these models yourself, so you're not having to reinvent the wheel. So having a broad cross-section of people who are exposed to these models will be able to use them in a good way for business-specific purposes. And I think so that's the skills. I know it's a very trite way of saying it. Skills is everything, because we're economists, right? Deepening capital productivity, right? You've got to deepen, deep capital productivity. So and the only way of doing that is by having more skilled people, and that's the main way of doing it. So PhD programs, joint programs, anything higher level of computer science, it'll gradually filter down, okay? It'll gradually be that this will be taught in undergraduate computer science, then it'll be in undergraduate business and management, and it'll gradually filter down. But at the moment, you need, masters and PhD students doing these STEAM kind of subjects, and having a good number of those and retaining them in the area. Second part is the answer to your question is what do you like about ChatGPT versus I'm going to say Llama, because DeepSeek, I've only ever used it a couple of times. I like the math model in DeepSeek. So the difference between ChatGPT and DeepSeek is that you pick the topic area. So you say, I want to do some math. All right, so you want to solve an equation or something like that. You got your kid. My son's 12. You have his homework. He needs some horrible homework that he's got to do, and he's got a puzzle to put it in. So DeepSeek's got a math solver that's dedicated to that. GPT is remarkable just because you can just chuck anything at it, and you don't need to pick a model or anything like that, and that's obviously why it's a big generalist model. I think for OpenAI products, probably the one I use the most is DAL3 for generating images, just because my whole family's become addicted to just generating images for Christmas cards and picture cards and things like that, and we just upload them to the supplier, and they print them off on a beautiful picture, and then they send them off. And as the resolution is improved, these cards become very beautiful, and you can really customize it to an individual. So you only get to know somebody, you know sorts of things that they really like, the TV show they like, or something like this, and you can create an abstract piece of sort of art that's very dedicated to that person. And that usually, I know my dad really likes the cards that we generate for him. So that's the one thing in OpenAI. I know it's not a ChatGPT one, it's DAL3, but they're related together. ChatGPT, I guess the rest of it, we use it a lot for, I use it a lot for checking my words. When I'm writing things like these slides have all been checked through ChatGPT. So I must confess I've used ChatGPT to do all of this sort of stuff. But the very best thing about Llama, and this is kind of so a couple of months ago, a group of civil servants from China came to the UK, and they wanted to know everything there is to know about regulation in the UK. So I had to generate a slide deck for them from the Financial Conduct Authority rule book, which is hundreds of pages long. And quite literally went into Llama and then just wrote a Python script that says, generate PowerPoint slides that summarizes, I don't know, insurance, those things. And it generated these beautiful slides, really beautiful slides that exactly summarizes all of the key content, because I only had about 2 days to do it, and it's just impossible to prepare in that time. So it can enable you to do things that you would never have been able to have done beforehand. Just increasing productivity hugely. And afterwards they were like, oh, the most professional presentation, brilliant. And I was like, and I said, oh, it must have taken you ages to do that. I said, it just took me yesterday. But I did it in Llama, and it was quite impressive. So DeepSeek Llama, because obviously Llama sits underneath it. Yeah, I think it's just that ability to automate the interaction is really, really impressive. And to engage with it, not just typing stuff into a prompt, but programmatically in a model basis on that front. So I'm sorry I talked too long, but it's a really good question.
Any more questions from the floor? Professor Williams, you've taken us into a very interesting journey into uncharted shores, basically, of AI. Learned quite a bit about the theoretical as well as the practical side of AI. Many people consider AI as more of a buzzword. However, it is clearly the way to the future. And using it to basically help in basically generating, indexing, and predicting sort of large data sets for economists, basically when they do their research and their studies, helping them basically having deeper understanding of the data, building scenarios where and projections of where things can go, and a large magnitude that was until recently impossible to do. So on behalf of KS, our audience, really thank you very much for this talk, and really appreciate making the time. I really also would like to thank our audience for making the time and joining us here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you very much. I mean, your time is very valuable, and to spend over an hour listening to myself is very kind. So thank you very much, and thank you for the excellent questions as well. That's really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. شكرا حضورنا الكرام، وإن شاء الله نشوفكم في محاضرات أخرى مع كياس. شكرا.